Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is George Hargis, and I'm the USPA PR and social media manager. And tonight, I am super excited to be speaking with two highly accomplished skydivers, Brianne Thompson, who has amassed over 16,000 skydives. She's got 7 world records, 16 North American continental records, 9 national records, and 10 state records. She has also earned medals in 8 world competitions and 6 USPA nationals to boot. Welcome, Brianne.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And I'm also happy to introduce Niklas Daniel, who has over 16,000 skydives, 4 world records, 17 North American continental records, 12 national records, and 17 state records, as well as medals in 12 world competitions and 18 U.S. national competitions. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
It's quite the list of things that you guys have achieved in your career of skydiving. It's pretty impressive.
Thank you.
So together, Brianne and Nick own and operate Access Flight School out of Arizona. And over the years, they've written many articles that have been published in Parachutist Magazine under the section Foundations of Flight. Tonight, we're going to focus on the articles that are directly related to Canopy flight. So without any further ado, let's get started. You both routinely teach Canopy courses. What topic do you typically start a course out with?
So whenever we start teaching Canopy, it's really important that we remind people the landing priorities. And the way Access teaches landing priorities is we obviously have an order. Number 1, level wing. Number 2, free of obstacles. And number 3, flare to at least half. However, what Access teaches is that while those are important, that's chronological order. We teach that no matter what, the most important thing on any skydive is you must flare. And it's important that we remind people of this, because once we start getting into performance stuff, or just quite simply just a little bit more advanced things, people tend to forget. So it's really important that no matter if you're first starting out or if you're a highly experienced jumper, remember that you still have your landing priority no matter what you're working on. Level wing, free of obstacles, but no matter what, you must flare.
That's a really good, really good reminder. I think especially a lot of us, I mean, I'm kind of guilty of this, is that you take your B license Canopy course and then you're out in the world of skydiving and you kind of maybe stop trying to pursue courses in Canopy flight so much. So I think it's good to remind people of those landing priorities. And I think it's really good that we have so many people interested in this webinar, because Canopy flight is such an important part of skydiving.
Well, and if I could add to that as well, is the B license Canopy course is great. However, our philosophy is that you don't necessarily need coaching on every single one of your jumps, but you definitely need coaching in every single phase that you are. And the way that we teach somebody with 50 skydives is going to be completely different when they have several hundred or 1,000 and they're on different wings. So we believe that your education should evolve with you as a jumper. And the B license course is great. It's an awesome place to start, but for sure, it's not going to carry you your whole career. So not just every single person, continue to get coaching. It's never too early and never too late to continue your education.
Yes, I 100% agree with that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the articles that you guys have written. I'm going to throw it back to May of 2023. There was an article that you guys wrote about harness position and inputs, and you gave some really good information about the position of the leg straps for Canopy flight. Brianne, can you tell me a little bit about this and why it's different? Like that leg strap position is different than the way we're like jumping with our leg straps?
Sure, absolutely. So anytime we're going to get started for flight, we want to configure our gear based on the job that we're about to do. So when we're about to go out in free fall, we want our gear nice and tight. We want it nice and snug. And when we're going to go possibly do free fly or sit fly, we want full mobility in our leg. And then what happens is when we pull, we tend to just hang from the harness from our crotch, which is fine. We can land with that, but it's not very comfortable and it's not super conducive to other things we might want to work on, which would be harness turns. So then we want to reconfigure our gear for canopy flight and landing. And the way that we teach that is just get comfortable first before you want to visually check your wing and make sure, do I have anything that I need to deal with? And if it seems visually good, then you want to start configuring. And we encourage starting with the leg straps, where you kind of pull them from, kind of think of forward or maybe even down a little bit. So you're not hanging from your crotch anymore, but you're now in a seated position. So the leg straps are more under the butt cheeks, kind of top of the thigh. And that gets your knees in front of you. It gets you in a little bit more of an athletic position. And now if you lean, you're going to have a little bit more response from the harness rather than just hanging from the crotch. And then after that, you would unstow your brakes, do your canopy control check. And then in order to be a little bit more comfortable, we would encourage to loosen the chest strap. Bear in mind, we want to adjust and loosen, but we don't actually undo anything. It's very important. So when we do leg straps, we're actually just talking the leg straps. We're not really touching the buckles at all. And then with the chest strap, it's quite simply with toggles in hand, loosening it in order to be more comfortable and configured in a landing position so that we can move around a little bit easier, and it's just a little bit configured. It's configured easier for landing as well. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think it's great. It's the reason why you would choose to do that is for definitely for comfort, but it allows you to tap into another way of maneuvering the wing as well. So you are able to fly in a more coordinated way. So essentially, when you are able to use weight shift to your advantage, you're essentially talking about, initially you're just learning to fly the parachute with your arms pretty much exclusively, right? But then as we get better, same thing in free fall, we're kind of trying to get away from doing everything with our upper body and starting to include the lower body as well. An analogy that I use very frequently with this is basically if you were to imagine riding a bicycle, you could turn just the handlebars, right? But everybody knows that we usually also lean a little bit in the direction that we want to go. And so that allows just for a little bit more coordinated way of turning. And it even takes some of the stress away that you might experience while pulling on the inputs with your arms as well. So when you actually do the weight shift properly, what you're actually trying to do is vertically offset the hip rings, right? And so by doing that, you essentially create a little chordwise crease in the canopy. So now you're basically, by offsetting those rings, you're essentially pulling down on the front and rear visor on that side. And so it actually creates a very clean turn in a really clean way to maneuver as well.
Yeah. That's kind of, I mean, you're basically talking about like harness inputs, right? That's what we would call a harness input in skydiver
Mm-hmm.
slang.
Yep.
So is there any drills that you would recommend? Like if someone hasn't necessarily tried harness inputs and they want to start figuring out how to use their lower body to fly their canopy, is there some drills that they should start practicing up high?
Yeah, for sure. I think first and foremost, polite reminder to everybody, make sure you have enough altitude and clear airspace when you're practicing something new. And so that's why hop and pops are so beneficial, is it usually gives us clear airspace, less canopy traffic to play with this. But make sure that you're doing these drills, any new drill, above your decision altitude. One of the things that we kind of encourage people is once you have established that your wing is good, you're going to keep it, you've done your systems check, if you will, your landability check, your controllability check, then just travel in a straight line, let go of the toggles, and really try to offset, like Nick said, offset those hip rings by leaning and seeing if you can get the canopy to respond. Left turns, right turns, start with maybe a 45-degree angle, then to a 90, and then a little bit more, bearing in mind paying attention to your altitude. But the reason we're encouraged trying this drill where you actually let go of your toggles is because a lot of times people are just kind of busy in the harness and they're not actually creating that offset and getting a good harness input, and they kind of don't even realize it, but they start cheating with the risers or the toggles. So by letting go, it just kind of holds you a little bit accountable to see if it's actually working. So it's just a good fun drill to try up high, because one of the things that we see a lot of the times is people start trying this stuff on landing and on final, and that may not be the best time low to the ground to experiment with something. Harness turns are great. They're just another way to fly your wing. But bear in mind, depending upon what size wing you have or your technique, you may not get as much of a payoff as some people say. So that's why it's important for you to explore your own wing, to go up and see, do harness turns work for me? Do harness inputs work for me? My wing may be really too big, or I don't have the right technique. So it's important to try stuff up high and then kind of implement it a little bit lower to the ground. But again, we see a lot of people experiment with things the first time on their final, and we would discourage that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely know what you mean about like some canopies react a little bit differently to those harness inputs. You know, like I'm very familiar with doing harness inputs on one canopy. I went to another one and I was like, wait, why isn't this working? So it
It
was
feels
like,
different. Yeah.
it felt totally different. And so it was like, oh, new canopy to me should practice that stuff before I'm landing.
Yeah, I mean, because like again, we'll read things on paper where we talk about harness input is really, it's a good thing and it's very responsive, and that is. But we also need to make sure our technique is good, and there is such an important tactile component to this. So being able to practice it, clear airspace up high, and when people say harness input, that should mean something specific to you as an individual. And if that's something that you want in your toolbox, or something that you need to practice a little bit more before it's implemented for certain scenarios.
I agree. And then certain scenarios. Nick, do you have any scenarios that like a harness input is like, like when would someone be using a harness input? Like
Well,
what are
honestly, I personally like to, always augment my inputs with a little bit of weight shift in there as well. And so anytime that I'm maneuvering really is when I implement it. But you might find that especially like during the deployment, for example, as the parachute is developing, you might want to make sure that you're already practicing weight shift there. A lot of times people kind of fall into the harness and are not really flying through the opening. And so as they're loading one leg strap more than the other, you could have things like off-heading openings and stuff like that. So that's probably one that everybody could practice right then and there. And then obviously, anytime that you're maneuvering, you're changing your heading, I would obviously include it there as well. And then there's also scenarios where you might find that if you're, for example, coming in on your final and you didn't necessarily set up the best wind correction angle for maybe like a quartering or crosswind or something like that, you could potentially use some harness inputs there as well, because you're not trying to make a very drastic change. You're just trying to adjust a little bit on that final. And that way you can still keep your hands relatively close to full flight to maintain the airspeed, so that way you're not messing with the amount of power that you'll have at the flare. So it still allows you some maneuverability and not taking away from your flare performance at the end.
Yeah, I think that was the first time that it started clicking with me with harness inputs. It was like, early on, you're like, arms all the way up. I don't want to do anything, just make sure I land and have all the flare power possible. But if you have those like minor adjustments that you need to make, trying them with your harness. But again, like
Oh, for
Brianne
sure.
said, try it up high first. Don't
Well,
figure it out for the first time on final.
try it up high, but at the same time, you were taught that when you were a young jumper, and it's because the priority is we don't want you too busy when you're low to the ground, right? And then as you get more experience, then we can kind of start giving people a little bit more stuff to practice. But again, coaching in all the phases, and make sure that your education is kind of evolving with you as a jumper as well.
For sure. Okay. Another topic that I think we're kind of catering to younger jumpers or lower number jumpers right now. Don't worry, stick around if you're highly experienced. We got lots of stuff for you. But another article that you guys wrote in 2022 was about flare technique. And I think something that a lot of newer skydivers struggle with early on is the arm position for a good flare. Nick, can you explain maybe some of the bad habits that you've seen as a result in a less than ideal flare, and like what would the ideal arm position for a good flare be?
Absolutely. So this is actually something that will affect not just younger or inexperienced jumpers. I actually see also people with many, many hundreds of jumps use techniques that don't necessarily give them the most authority over their parachute is really what it comes down to. And so a lot of that stems from doing arm motions that usually will either impede on or kind of hinder either their motion through either inability to move in a particular way or because of strength issues, right? So very common scenarios that I see is when people will go to flare and they'll kind of use almost like a jumping jack motion where they're kind of moving their arms out to the side, their arms are locked out straight, and they're putting a lot of torque on their shoulders that way. And their arms are also moving in a path that's going to take more time, right? So it's more distance. So you're not going to get the response that you're probably looking for out of the wing when you flare that way. Another very common one that I see is when people flare and they kind of, bring their hands down like a pull-up, and so their elbows then kind of rest kind of by their torso, and then they try to just rotate their hand down, and it's basically like a tricep extension. So now they're just using a singular muscle group to try and now land their parachute. And while a lot of people might be fit and are able to do that, they're still kind of putting themselves at a disadvantage. So one of the things that I try to stress when I film people's landings and show it to them, a lot of times people are actually fully, like completely unaware of the arm motions that they're actually using to get the parachute to stop. And so a lot of times their hands end up moving in either in awkward ways or end up in a position that's not really allowing them to get the stopping power that they need. And so in that particular article that you referenced, I talked about becoming more aware of the motion of the hands, specifically keeping the hands close to the torso, and then actually kind of moving the elbows out of the way and then kind of pushing those hands down kind of towards your pockets, as it were, right? So that way you're actually recruiting more muscles for that flaring motion. And so you'll probably find that you have a little bit more authority and a little bit more response as you move those toggles in that way. And so that was kind of the intent of that article.
Yeah, and actually, you guys made a YouTube video about some strengthening exercises to kind of perfect that flare. So I will make sure that all of the attendees get that link so you can go watch the video. I don't want to give it to you now because I don't want to lose you.
No, that's fine. And so and keep in mind that that video was created, with a personal trainer that we had. So, he was able to kind of come up with some of the exercises. And the intent again was to, in a low stress environment, to be kind of able to work on those motions and becoming aware of, hey, yeah, actually, when I do it this way, that's actually kind of kind of awkward or cumbersome. And then also, if we actually do get the technique down, if it is something that we still struggle with, we can build some strength there that will then help do it in the real world, obviously.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, of course. All right, so we went over the ideal leg strap position for harness inputs. But another article that you guys wrote in November 2023 talks about the rest of the body under canopy and how your whole body position affects the range of your canopy. Brianne, can you tell us what a spread out body position will do due to the canopy's flight and why someone might want to use that as a tool for flying their canopy?
Absolutely. So the most common thing that happens to young jumpers is they tend to overshoot their landings. Usually we set up our pattern a little bit too close. And by spreading out the body and making it big, it's very similar. It's the exact same aerodynamics as free fall. If you just imagine those of us that have flown in the tunnel or been in free fall, if I'm flying relative next to somebody and I get big, I tend to go up. And if you take that into canopy flight, you're introducing drag into the system, and it makes you sit a little bit further back, and then it changes the pitch of the wing just a little bit so that it shortens your glide path. Now, this is a very subtle thing. It's very, very small, but by doing a spread out position, you can kind of shorten your final a little bit. And so if you feel like I'm going to overshoot, you can get big, introduce a little bit of drag, change the pitch slightly, ever so slightly, and then it kind of changes the glide path to shorten up that spot a little bit.
Okay.
I think it would be important to note, though, as well, that if you're going to be overshooting by a lot, let's say hundreds of feet or something like that, then this technique is probably not for you, right? We're talking about somebody that already has dialed in their patterns pretty well, and we're talking about just kind of cleaning it up just by a few feet, like you're trying to land into a box, or maybe like close to some cones or something like that. Flying your body in addition to the parachute, right? That's kind of really the goal of it. So, if you're somebody who's still struggling to, even land in the landing area, or like, for example, out here in Arizona, you're overshooting the grass and we're talking about overshooting the target by hundreds of feet, then this technique is not going to be like the magic bullet that's going to cure everything, right? It's really just dialing in those last few feet here and there.
Okay, awesome. As someone who's trying to always work on landing close to the box or whatever accuracy thing I'm trying to do, it's very helpful to have that little tweak that you can use.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so what's the opposite of spreading out? What body position would that look like, Nick?
Yeah, it's a ball up.
Yeah, so basically, in principle, if we were to make our body smaller, almost kind of if you were to think about kind of feedling up a little bit, right, kind of pulling up the legs and getting to a small kind of tuck ball, then that would help streamline the body. And so now we have less drag than before. And so what can happen is that the body actually moves slightly forward under the wing, right, and it actually flattens out the glide and the trajectory a little bit. So again, if you're just going to be a few feet short of the target and you want to try and extend that glide, right, rather than necessarily getting like super crazy by jumping on your risers or doing anything crazy like that, just trying to actually pick up your legs, trying to streamline a little bit. Again, same thing. It can also try to just kind of polish up those last few feet to try and put you on that target. Now, this is also something that you could use for a long spot scenario if you are going to be flying in a straight line for several minutes, right? If you can actually stay in a streamlined shape, then the longer you stay in it, the more you would benefit from it as well.
Yeah, I've definitely been in that position.
Yeah. And this is, again, where good leg strap positioning can help.
Okay, and then a third body position that you guys talk about in the article is the torpedo. Brianne, can you tell
yes.
that looks like? Yeah.
So the torpedo it's kind of a funny term, but it's something that we originally Brianne and I learned while we were going learning how to paraglide and things of that nature, and it's something that I've personally also used in swoop competitions. And so by using a very long chest strap, it actually allows performance Canopy pilots to, if they're trying to, for example, go for like maximum distance, right, to kind of lean forward in the harness, and it has this kind of torpedo shape. It's very streamlined. And so that's kind of the extreme equivalent of streamlining, right? And so you're trying to further reduce your drag in that process. Nowadays, what's really interesting, so you could argue that that's kind of a prone position, right? And so now the new thing is, well, it's not super new, but you're seeing more commonplace now is the mutant harness that's been developed. And so now a lot of competitors are now actually in the supine position, where they're actually able to, through a kind of a more complicated system of 3 rings, be able to actually change the geometry of the harness, which is now kind of more closely related to a paraglider, where it's kind of more by the waist. And it also allows people to lean way back and also kind of reduce that drag. So that's kind of where it's evolving to now. So instead of doing the torpedo, people are now in more of the supine position.
The reverse torpedo.
There you go.
Okay, let's move on to my personal favorite Canopy flight subject, which is the accuracy trick, which you guys wrote about in 2023. Nick, can you tell us about the accuracy trick?
Sure. So probably starting out by defining it, as it were. So the accuracy trick usually refers to a visual phenomenon that happens. And so just to kind of give it some context here, it's something that's, I think, innately known to all of us. And it's even to the point where in visual medias, for example, like movies and like video games and stuff like that, they use the same visual trick to kind of help guide us understand where our motion is taking us. And so in simplest terms, the accuracy trick is a phenomenon that happens as I move through space. Where it is that I'm heading, I will typically see that location get bigger and larger in my visual field. And there are going to be areas surrounded by that that are typically moving kind of more down in my visual field, and things that are moving up and things that are kind of moving around. So it kind of creates this radial optic flow pattern. And so you see that very common, like I said, in movies and video games. And so the trick for us to become more accurate is to actually being able to identify that spot as we're moving under Canopy. And so there are some drills and stuff that we can recommend for people to start being able to identify it. And once you've seen it, you can't really unsee it. That's kind of the nice thing about it. But a lot of people struggle with it because the more you maneuver and the more you change your heading with your canopy, the less likely you are to ever see it, right? So I hope that answers the questions in terms of what the accuracy trick is. And the idea now is that once you understand where your trajectory is actually taking you, right, it is to then place that spot that doesn't move, that people refer to as the accuracy trick, is to take that and place it on top of the target, or actually more correctly, just slightly ahead of it, because we know that as we flare, we typically glide a little bit and then land on target that way.
So to add to that, what you can start with is a lot of times when we're young jumpers, we notice we're going to be accurate or not accurate on final. And the goal would be to notice it sooner and sooner. And like Nick said, the more you travel in a straight line, the easier it's going to be to see that. But there's certain parts, again, in the vision that if it starts to rise, you're going to come up short in your vision. And if it starts to fall, you're going to overshoot it. But depending upon where you are, having overshooting something means you have a little bit more altitude that you can work with. And so just being able to dial that, you basically need to configure your eyes, and you need to calibrate your eyes to what you and your wing are going to be doing. And like Nick said, a lot of people spend so much time maneuvering because it's fun, but that definitely changes my glide and where I'm going to end up. And so the more I turn, the harder it is to see that.
So if I may add to that as well, is that's actually one of the main reasons why we do the long spot. So a lot of times people think the long spot, the whole purpose is just to make it back. And that's actually not true. The whole idea is that if you are flying in a straight line for an extended period of time, it allows you to work on that visual acuity to actually see, okay, where does this parachute go while it's in full flight, right? And then once I can kind of identify that spot, okay, that spot isn't going up or down, that's basically roughly where I'm heading, then we can start changing, for example, the glide path by maybe applying a little bit of risers or a little bit of brakes, and then seeing if we can notice that spot change, right? And so that's when we actually start to take a little bit more command of the wing and where it's going, because we have more predictive power of where that glide's going to take us. And naturally, on a long spot too, what you're worried about is, hey, like the terrain that I'm flying over, am I going to be able to cover all of that, right? And so if you can see already where the parachute's taking you, and you can identify it much sooner rather than just 300 feet or lower, you can then already start planning an out, right? And hopefully you've already done that in your pre-flight planning, obviously. But if you've already can identify, hey, I'm not going to make that, and you're doing that at 2,000 to 3,000 feet up, then you can already go ahead and pick an out on your way back.
Very cool. I just want to go do lots of long spots now. Okay, so we've kind of covered a lot of the very basics, but now I want to dig a little bit of little deeper and get kind of nerdy. And you guys wrote about some canopy flight dynamics in March of 2022. Brianne, can you tell us about the different terminology that's in that article? There's yaw, pitch, and roll, and you guys put it in relation to canopy flight.
Yeah, so basically, yaw, pitch, and roll is our movement through space. Pitch is, if you think of the nose, it pitches up, pitches down. So it's pitched down when we're in a dive, pitches up when we flare. And then there is, we have roll, which is our bank. So anytime we turn, we have one wingtip lower than the other, one higher, and that is bank. And then yaw is basically just the nose kind of moving left and right. With parachutes, it's very difficult to have yaw exclusive. Airplanes have rudders and all these other things that allow them to kind of do that while remaining level. With parachutes, yaw and roll are pretty intertwined. So anytime I change heading, I'm going to have a little bit of a pitch change as well as a heading change for those together. So when we talk about that, do you necessarily need these very nerdy phrases, as you said? No, but it does deep dive because there are a lot of smart people out there that kind of want to put these together. And so when we're teaching this stuff, it's important to know, again, pitch, flare, and dive, roll, and yaw and roll are pretty connected with our flexible wings. So we can't really, it's difficult for us to separate them like we could an airplane. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, so basically, anytime that you're talking about moving through three-dimensional space, you want to be able to identify which movement we're talking about, right? So that's good for talking about concepts, or maybe even for the debrief. And so, we have basically three axes in space, right? That we can talk about. And so essentially, if you were to draw a vertical line through your system, meaning like you have your canopy and the person here, and you were to just punch a vertical line straight through it, then the rotation around that vertical axis would be yaw, right? If you were to go side to side or laterally, then that rotation around that axis would be pitch, right? And then if you were to have one front to back, or would be longitudinally, you would then have roll or banking. And so it's just describing what's happening. So if we were to basically film a landing and we were to see that maybe somebody has an asymmetrical flare, for example, and it causes the wing to, bank during that flaring process, that we know, okay, like, hey, we've introduced a little bit of roll in there that we don't want to necessarily see, right? And we want to continue to see the nose come up or pitch upward. So it's just a more precise way, more precise language to talk about motion through space.
And is there like specific like inputs that I'm giving? Like obviously you guys said the turn, the bank, like we all know toggles turn, but like as far as like pitch goes, like are there or inputs that I'm doing as a pilot to change those?
Yeah, absolutely. So the big thing is in simplest terms, anytime that you have a symmetrical input, so be it, for example, on both toggles simultaneously, or let's say, maybe both fronts or both rears, if you're doing that symmetrically, then typically what's going to result is a pitch change, right? If I have an asymmetrical input, again, whether it's just, one side or possibly even one leg strap, because again, I'm doing a harness input, then that heading change is going to be kind of a coupled motion between roll and yaw. So it's really just about being able to identify what those motions are and what application you want to use them for, is really what it comes down to.
Awesome. Okay, before we run out of time, and I want to make sure we have time to take some questions from our audience, but I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about another article that you guys wrote in April of 2022. And Nick, we typically use the skydiver slang terminology of flight cycle, but there's another super fun word, nerdy word, that you use in the article.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
All right. So the big thing is first of all, if I can just kind of tangent off here for a second. So whenever we write these articles, people have to understand that we're very limited on space, right? Because we're trying to take a concept that we can address to the general public, but then also, with pictures and everything, it gets very crammed. And so while skydiver slang is great, and as long as everybody's on the same page when they communicate, that's fantastic, right? The big thing that's really important to me is that I really try to use more physics terms than anything, because if you wanted to go and do more research on your own after having read this article, and you were to look up the slang term flight cycle, you're not really going to come across the concept that we discussed. So there's a funny term that we used instead, and it's called phugoid. So phugoid is just kind of a funny, fancy term, but basically, when your canopy is in a steady state configuration, if there's anything that then upsets that, whether it's basically an input from you or maybe some turbulence, we typically experience a little bit of oscillation as a result of that. And so in order to become the best canopy pilot that you can be, it's about being able to basically predict and control these oscillations. So when people talk about the fly site in skydiving, what it typically comes down to is we understand that the canopy is trimmed for a particular flight path that it takes through the air, right? We usually refer to it as trim speed when it's in full flight. And so if I were to, for example, now go into brakes and I start applying more drag to the system and I start slowing down the airspeed, I depart from that trim speed trajectory. And so what would happen as a result, if I were to then let my hands up, for example, very quickly, we experience what's called a surge, right? The canopy goes nose down and we start to speed up again. And that's because the canopy is, like I said, designed to home in on back onto that trim angle that it was designed for. So we naturally kind of get that as a result of having maintained the slower airspeed and then letting it back up, it wants to surge forward. And then on the opposite side is if we were to accelerate the canopy, be it through, for example, a turn or maybe even a little bit of front risers, you're going to notice that the canopy is going to have more airspeed than what it was originally designed for. And so what it's going to do is it's going to generate lift out of that energy that you produced. And so it typically planes out, again, trying to home in on that trim angle. And so those oscillations being on the top and bottom of that is what people refer to as the canopy cycling, trying to get back in on that. And so depending on what maneuvers you do, the idea is that we want to have control over the parachute at all times so we don't overshoot on those oscillations. It's a very proactive piloting approach.
Yes. And in the article as well, I think there was some mention of like what your body is doing under the wing as all of these changes are happening. Brianne, can you kind of clarify, like when we're doing like a flat turn or we're doing a performance turn, what is the body doing under the wing at those times?
Sure. So anytime we do a bank or we turn, the body can kind of come out from underneath the wing. And the more it is outside of that, the more we're diving. And then a flat turn is we are trying to not be as far out and we're trying to stay under the wing as much as possible. Now, of course, there's going to be a little bit of a deviation, but when we're in full flight, we're a little bit behind the wing. But then if we turn aggressively or a bank or a high angle of bank, we come out to the side, and that's where we have our body and our nose of the canopy going down at the same time. Like we have an aggressive dive. So we basically, when we do flat turns, we go to brakes and we try to change our heading with minimal altitude loss. We tend to stay under the wing a little bit more.
Anything to add to that, Nick?
It basically comes down to controlling your position under the wing, right? So if I want to dive aggressively, then absolutely, I probably want to have, a very sharp aggressive turn that puts my body and the canopy almost on level with each other, and I'm going to have a long recovery arc as a result. But if I need to create a heading change while losing the least amount of altitude, I'm going to use a different maneuver in order to try and stay under the wing as I create that heading change. So again, both are turns, but they're used in very different ways for different scenarios.
Yeah, and we definitely don't want to be doing that high performance turn close to the ground. We need to drill this into people. Okay. Anything that we didn't cover that you guys, like in the questions that I went through, is there anything that you wanted to elaborate more on? Or
no, I think you covered it pretty good. I think we just, unless anybody else has any other questions.
Oh yeah, we got questions. Okay, cool. So Braden, and maybe we might have to ask him to clarify a little bit more, but he asked, can you touch on progressive flaring for canopies such as the Pulse? With that progressive flaring.
I'm not sure exactly what this person means by progressive flaring, but I think maybe down the path that I could take it is typically you're going to find that there's going to be different flare techniques for different size parachutes. So, and a lot of times it seems very contradictory, but one of the things that people need to understand is that when you have typically a larger parachute with a longer line set, a lot of times what you'll find is that the flaring is a little bit more effective if you actually move your hands down a little bit quicker initially and then try to kind of slower down the motion towards the end. So that's typically what we kind of start out learning as students as well. But then typically as we start to maybe downsize or go to parachutes that are a little bit more aggressive and a little bit smaller line sets, you'll typically find that then almost the opposite is true. So as you're coming in and for the landing, because of how responsive that canopy is, typically a slower, smoother input is usually all that's necessary to get that canopy to plane out. And then we'll typically, as the airspeed dies down, then usually kind of speed up a little bit on the bottom end. So it really depends on what type of parachute you're flying. So I would argue the physics is the same on all of it, right? But typically the application, because of the handling characteristics, is going to be slightly different. I
Okay.
hope that answers the question.
I hope so too. And Braden, if that didn't answer the question, you can just write in the chat maybe if you want to specify on something a little bit
Yes.
more.
Thank you for the question.
Jimmy said first, thanks for the valuable information. Would you guys recommend taking a Canopy course at every downsize, or would you push it more towards practicing what you know on a familiar Canopy platform before like changing platforms?
Yes to both. So I think one of the big things is uh, we can take Canopy courses, but we know for a fact that we don't absorb every single thing out of that course. We as humans we can't retain that. So even though people have taken a course before, it's good to take another course or even the same one from someone different, because who knows what other information is out there. Now, I don't want to make it sound like you need coaching on every single one of your jumps. No, no, no. I think take a course, get some coaching, go out and play and see what sticks. See what you're improving on, or what you still need you still have a little bit of a deficiency on, and something that you want to improve on, and then go back and redo it. Um, a lot of times we don't necessarily need coaching every time we downsize, but what coaching usually does offer during those periods is somebody's filming you and can give you instantaneous feedback. What we want to avoid as a jumper is guessing, because there's so much stuff in this sport that is counterintuitive to what we think. And so it's really nice when we can get instantaneous feedback, and if we have a question based on a specific scenario. Um, One of the things that we always say with people is, if you have a good landing or a bad landing and you don't know why, that is one of the worst phases to be in, because you're not sure what to repeat and you're not sure what to avoid. So I don't at all want to make it sound that you need coaching every single jump, but you definitely need coaching in every single phase. And if you kind of feel that a downsize is a big step, absolutely get some guidance during that. And nothing's wrong with that. And there's also nothing wrong with experimenting a little bit with yourself. We do want people to go out and grow, but you should come back with certain questions, because a lot of stuff that we see, Nick and I call it packing mat coaching, where people are out and the intention is good, but other jumpers who are not professional Canopy coaches are just giving out advice. But sometimes the advice that they're giving, or some of the knowledge out there, is so oversimplified to the point where it actually becomes incorrect. And so sometimes we oversimplify something so somebody can catch a quick concept, but that oversimplification does have some drawbacks as well, and it's not always accurate in every single scenario.
I think if I may add to that as
Please.
well. So one of the things that we do with our Canopy courses, we actually hand everybody an outline of the drills and the purpose of why we have people do these exercises. And so in our philosophy, it's better to grow out of a canopy than into one. And so being really able to control and have authority over the wing that you're flying before moving on to the next one. Because while a lot of skills might be transferable, the sensitivity and handling might be different, right? So all these drills that we hand out in the outline is definitely a good checklist to be like, okay, can I do all of these things proficiently? And if yes, then I might be able to take on, another wing and maybe play with something else. And then same thing, you go through that whole same checklist again, right? And you just kind of progressively work your way forward. And I think it's just important to have a little bit of structure there. That's really it. So again, like Brianne said, get some coaching, get some of that structure, right? Go out in the world, play a little bit. And then as you're ready to move on to something new, then maybe come back, get some more structure, and also be able to get a little bit of a heads up in terms of how that new parachute might behave as well, right? So that's kind of a nice little piece of intel to get.
That's awesome. That was a very thorough answer to that question. Thank you guys. Hopefully, Jimmy, that answered your question. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name terribly. Nishant Singh asked, is it okay to gently pull on the rears if you're going to come up short of the target on final?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. So let me begin. There is absolutely nothing wrong with touching your risers, doing harness inputs, and knowing all that. And from a flight fact, yes, pulling on your rears will extend your glide. But the whole purpose that we have in our B license course is how are you pulling on them? And so many people may not be pulling them correctly, and they actually pull too much, and then they kind of risk a stall. So to answer the question in several parts, can pulling down the rears extend the glide? Yes. Are we opposed to doing that for accuracy? No. But without us having seen everybody land, we can't assume that everybody is executing that correctly. And so that's where we're cautious of get coaching and make sure that you're doing it correctly in order for it to be effective.
So I think if I can also add to that, so just to give a little bit of a heads up, so objectively what's going to happen is if you apply a little bit of rears to increase the glide, it comes at the expense of airspeed. So if you were to start using the rears and you're getting lower and lower to the ground, when you then basically start the flaring process, you're going to notice that you don't have as much energy as you would have had being in full flight. And that kind of goes back to the whole flight cycle phugoid concept that we had talked about, right? And so naturally, if you were to now let up on the rears, as you then transition to toggles, you're going to notice the canopy is going to surge momentarily, right? And so then as you start to bring the brakes down, you're going to notice there's almost like a long dead spot before the canopy reacts. And so that would be something that I would make this person very aware of, that if you want to start, extending the glide, you might be better off right now just using that small body position that we talked about earlier and maintain the airspeed rather than trying to just, get on the rears and possibly maybe even do them incorrectly. And one of the things that Brianne and I usually talk about too, it's not a good idea to get busier as you get lower to the ground, right? Brianne says this all the time. You should be unloading chores as you get close to your target. And so getting busier right as you're about to get to the target is a lot of times more of a crutch technique and is usually a sign that we need more work on pattern work, right? We need to dial in the pattern work more rather than trying to get on final and then trying to do these big changes, because now you're also transitioning from one flight mode to another. And again, not but 2 weeks ago, I actually saw somebody drop a toggle, just a sport jumper, out in the landing area because it was doing exactly that scenario, trying to stretch the glide. And then as soon as you let go of the rears, he dropped one toggle and had a little bit of a hard landing because of it. So,
and again, we're not trying to come out with scare techniques. Of course, we want every single person out there to be very, very good with every part of their canopy, the rears, the fronts, all of that, and then knowing the scenarios to put it in. But sometimes it is a little bit scary for us when we don't know who's asking the question in front of us to say yay or nay. so we kind of have to be a little bit cautious with that. But yes, rears do extend the glide. Should you be doing that low to the ground? It depends on how good our landings are and how well we're executing that technique.
I think that's a great response to that. Yeah, I think anyone who's attending this webinar, hopefully everyone understands that we're not able to coach the people that we cannot see. So that was very
still talking in generalities.
Yeah.
Yes, speaking in generalities. But you said something that just time flashback to me, because I remember I took your guys' Canopy course to work on my accuracy landings. And Brianne, you said to me, because I had all these things, I was like, I front riser and then I rear riser and I surge, and you were like, shh, calm down on final, just not so many things. And that helped me a lot. So I appreciate it.
No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, from a safety standpoint, is one of the things that we see, because we watch a lot of landings, and there's a lot of techniques that, again, are so oversimplified that people are trying to apply these to their final. And the truth of the matter is, and we're not trying to be rude when we say this, but we call final for a reason, is you all of your planning has come to that. And if you find yourself regularly coming up short, then that's something that we need to adjust in the pattern. And final should be that is one of the most critical phases of our flight. So it should truly be one of the more calm moments that we have, and we need to make it that way. And if we find ourselves very busy, then it definitely means that something fundamental is breaking down in our pattern before that we need to address.
Yes.
And incidentally, how we fix that here is we actually implement not just video on the debrief, but we also use GPS tracking as well. So for anybody that might be interested or on the fence about maybe coming out to visit us and taking a course, our advanced accuracy course in particular, that's where we implement that type of technology as well. So we can actually put your flight onto Google Earth. You can see where you were, how high you were, and how you got to the position that you're in. And then it's a lot easier to work with that objective data rather than like, I think you were here, or maybe we're at this altitude. It's really nice to have really hard data to be able to work with. And you see the improvements very drastically, very quickly because of that.
I didn't know you guys could do that. I'm like, all right, checking my calendar, when to go see Nikki. Seriously. Okay, on to the next question. We still have a lot of people in the chat that need their answers to their questions. Okay, so Brian asks, I'd like to know if during harness turns, is it beneficial to raise the opposite leg in addition to lowering the turn side to make a 45 or 90 degree turn? I'm guilty of using harness turns on final and not at other times. I'm a newer jumper, 107 jumps.
I'll start and then Nick can clean up whatever I miss. Yeah. So first off, again, there's nothing wrong with using harness like on final, and that's fine. We just, again, want you to be good at it and proficient at it when you're coming in. So lifting the leg. So everybody's going to have a different technique of how they can do harness turns. And one of the things that we see a lot is, I can't mime it right now while I'm sitting here, but we see a lot of people sitting in their harness and they're definitely lifting their legs and they're very busy, but they're not actually shifting any of the balance. And so that's where they're busy and they're burning a lot of calories, but they're not actually getting what they want out of the wing. And so that's why up high practicing, you'll know if that's good. So some people do actually lift a leg, which also allows them to lift part of that hip and allows them to kind of bank. I personally, and this might be this might confuse some people, and if that's the case, just throw it out. That's totally fine. But the way I like to do harness turns is when my knees are up, I actually take my heels in the opposite direction of where I want to go because that shifts me. That's something that I think of, and that may be way too confusing for somebody else. But there's always more than one way to do something, but I can't without actually seeing this person execute this. What I have seen is a lot of people who lift their leg, they're just busy, but they're not actually getting any weight shift in the wing. Can't say that that's what's happening here, but that is a common thing that we see.
I think, like we talked about it earlier, it's important that if you want to have an effective weight shift, that the hip rings basically get offset vertically. And so if you were, sitting fairly balanced, just lifting a leg, it's not guaranteed that change happens. So personally, for me, the way I like to think about it is if I have an imaginary line connecting my nose and my belly button, right, that's a vertical line. I actually, personally, for me, if I want to turn left, I actually have to kind of camp that line, right? And so I feel my weight actually kind of removing from one leg strap. So I'm kind of unloading one leg strap and shifting all my weight into the other. And so you can do that and then also experiment with leaning forwards and backwards a little bit to kind of figure out for your body and your harness geometry what would be most effective.
Hope that helps.
Yeah. Okay. Robert asked, best advice for a previously experienced jumper coming back into the sport after a few decades regarding techniques and new canopy selection.
Yes. So there's a resurrection award in there somewhere in there too, right?
That's
great. So welcome back. That's awesome.
So first off, welcome back. I think the big thing is one of the things that happens that when we're experiencing, I'm not saying this is the case for this individual, but a lot of times we try to pick up right where we left off. And I think it's okay to be okay with upsizing several sizes, be okay with, again, getting coaching because the sport has changed a lot. Things that we used to teach 10, 20 years ago, we don't do anymore. And we don't even necessarily realize what maybe training scars we might have and what holes we may have in our training. So have an open mind, start all the way over from the beginning. And you still have a lot of experience that you can draw from. And we do want to build off of that, but just kind of come in as though it's a brand new sport and then just come in with an open mind, realizing that something that you may know, we may have a new way to teach it, or that may not be accurate anymore. So if you come in as like a beginner, you'll still have experience that you can draw from, but come in like you're brand new to the sport and you'll be amazed at how easy you will be able to kind of fix some of those training scars, and we will be able to kind of plug some of those training holes, if you will, and we'll be able to discover where those might be, and in order to make this more fun and enjoyable for you.
And I think also it doesn't necessarily pertain to this individual, but it's very hard sometimes when you've done something and it was a long time ago, to, like Brianne said, to pick up exactly right where you left off. And I think it's important for safety reasons to basically just kind of step back a little bit, kind of put the ego aside and say like, hey, I understand that I used to fly a 150 or whatever it was, and just kind of say, hey, I'm going to upsize a little bit until I kind of get back into it, right? And so your bandwidth needs to open up quite a bit again. And so once that happens, and then you want to, try out a new wing that maybe wasn't available to you back then, right? Canopy's come in so many different flavors now. I would encourage anybody really to try and really figure out that after you've maybe demoed or tried several different wings that are appropriate for your skill level, is to figure out exactly what you like about a particular wing, right? So it's like, hey, I like the opening characteristics of this one. I like how much glide this one has, and I like the flare power of this one. And so you can bring that information then to an experienced canopy coach, and they might be able to direct you towards a canopy that might embody almost, maybe not necessarily all of them, but most of those characteristics, right? And so you end up on a wing that you very much enjoy and love.
And then I'd actually like to add to this too, because this is something that now that, I mean, we've been in the sport 20 years plus, I'm middle-aged now. And so I have a different view now than I did 15, 20 years ago. And the truth of the matter is no matter how fit we feel we are, even if we are, as we get older, we just are a little bit slower. Doesn't mean we can't learn new things. And it doesn't mean that we can't be awesome at this, but it does mean that sometimes when I did something in my 20s and then maybe take time off and then come, I am going to be different with my reaction time and my processing speed as somebody middle-aged or even somebody a little bit older. There's no shame in that. Just be aware of that. And I know a lot of times when we get older, we get frustrated with like, man, this used to be so easy for me 10 years ago, and it may not be as easy. Doesn't mean it can't be relearned. Doesn't mean you can't be awesome at it, but it may just mean that the learning time you can anticipate might take a little bit longer than what you might remember or you were used to.
That is a great reminder about coming back and reaction times for sure. Like, starting to feel it too, guys.
It's just a
Everything
fact.
hurts.
It just we take longer in the morning and all the stuff, it's just
Yep.
a thing.
Yep. Okay. We have very limited time left, but I do want to get through the last two questions that I thought were important to answer. So we had someone ask about rear risers, if they're trying to get to their target on final, and then someone else, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name. They asked front risers, like if they're gonna overshoot on final, is front risers appropriate?
That's a great question. So again, when you're going to be using front risers, again, you're getting busier to the ground. First and foremost, I would want to make sure they're using proper hand placement. Again, we did put an article and some videos out there for that, because again, I have actually seen firsthand a lot of people get injured because they actually didn't have proper technique of initiating the fronts, and they weren't able to let go of them properly, or they actually dropped the toggle in the process. So we want to make sure that first and foremost, we practice this up high, switching back and forth between those different inputs. The other thing that's really important about this is to understand what the canopy actually does when you apply the fronts. So people's perception a lot of the times is that when you pull on the fronts that the canopy pitches nose down like this, and that's actually not the case. It creates kind of a more of an S shape that's referred to as reflex camber, and I'm just going to leave it at that. You can look that up more if you'd like. But essentially what ends up happening is, depending on how much you use it, you're essentially degrading the glide of the canopy, and it will pick up a little bit of speed in the process. And so now keep in mind that when you also pick up more speed based on that flight cycle Fugit discussion that we had earlier, that when you ultimately let up on those fronts again, right, that canopy is going to want to glide, right? It has all that extra speed available now, and so it's going to cover a little bit more distance. So the question a lot of times you have to ask yourself is it really going to be beneficial? Like, is the juice worth the squeeze, so to speak, right? So if I'm really just, if I'm going to overshoot just a few feet, and now I'm thinking, oh, let me go ahead and bury those front risers, right? Well, if I then build more speed in the process, I'm probably going to end up in the same spot that I was anyway. And so, again, it can be a very useful tool to, again, polish up maybe just a few feet here and there. I would probably argue maybe just getting into that big body position we talked about at the beginning of the webinar might be a thing I would try first, because that way you're not messing with the airspeed of the system. But then, yeah, also making sure that you let off on those front risers at an appropriate altitude so that the system can recover is incredibly important. So, can it be done? Absolutely. Is it something that I would recommend, especially to newer jumpers? Definitely not.
With that said, go and practice up high. And so my advice to people who want to play with their fronts, up high above your decision altitude, make sure that you've got the proper toggle technique, the proper hand placement. We've written some articles and done some videos on that. But every time you pull in the fronts, go to a flare and just kind of practice that muscle memory, because one of the things that we've seen, and we're not always trying to make everything doom and gloom, but what we definitely see is people using fronts too low to the ground, and then they're definitely changing how the canopy's descent is, and they're caught off guard with how rapidly they're descending, and then that definitely changes their flare timing. And so, like Nick said, theoretically, yes. Would we advise that? Not without the proper steps. And again, I'll say it again, the proper coaching to make sure that the technique and the execution is appropriate.
Love that. Okay, I think we are out of time.
You said there was another one.
Let's see. Well, there's a lot of people just saying thank you, and they really appreciate the discussion and the presentation. I do want to let our audience members know that Nick and Brianne run Access Flight School, and they do love to teach. So if you have questions and you want to get some coaching, feel free to reach out to them. Is email the best? How to
Yeah.
I would say if you want to see a catalog of what we have available, you can certainly go to our website, which is www.accessflightschool.com. And then if you do want to reach out to us, we do have a lot of links on those different pages so you can basically pick the type of coaching that you might be looking forward to. And if you have any other questions, feel free to email us at info@accessflightschool.com.
And we're located at Skydiver, Arizona, and we teach all year round. And so we'd love to, sorry for those of you guys that we couldn't get to all of your questions, but we'd love to see some of your faces, and we'd love to have you guys out here.
Absolutely.
And I just want to let everybody know that this has been recorded, and everyone will get an email with this recorded video, so you can come back and reference it at a later time if you want. It will also be put up on the USPA YouTube page. It takes a little bit of time for me to download it off the Zoom cloud and then get it ready for YouTube and then upload it onto YouTube. So don't expect it to be there first thing tomorrow morning, but it will be there sometime next week.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much.
George, USPA, thank you guys for hosting this. And for everybody else that tuned in and asked questions, we really appreciate it. I definitely think that everybody's participation helps make this sport grow. And so thank you, everybody, for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much. We'll see you later.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Have a good one.